That resident, a man who had served with the 121st Infantry Regiment of the 8th Infantry Division, was one of the 3 lost soldiers from that Christmas Eve. In January 1996, Fritz Winken traveled to Maryland to meet him in person, more than 50 years after the events in question. The veteran had kept a German compass, reportedly gifted to him that night, for the entirety of the intervening decades. Their reunion offered the clearest independent confirmation the story would ever receive, coming not from a family's own retelling, but from the surviving testimony of a man who had lived through it wearing a different uniform, compared with other documented wartime fraternizations, and there were a handful across both world wars. The Winken episode stands out for how completely undirected it was. This was not an organized truce negotiated between officers, of the kind occasionally seen in earlier conflicts, nor was it a deliberate act of resistance by either military. It was a decision made entirely by a civilian woman with no authority beyond her own household, extended to men from both sides who had far more reason to distrust one another than to cooperate. No German command sanctioned the German soldiers' decision to disarm and share a meal with the enemy, and certainly none sanctioned providing them with navigational assistance afterward. Both acts, on both sides, occurred entirely outside any chain of command, at considerable personal risk to everyone involved. The historical impact of the story is, admittedly, more symbolic than material. It changed no battle, altered no strategic outcome, and appears nowhere in the operational histories of either army. Its significance lies almost entirely in what it demonstrates about individual choice under conditions explicitly designed to eliminate that choice. The Battle of the Bulge, into which this small episode is set, remains one of the costliest battles fought by the United States Army in the war, with casualties eventually exceeding 75,000 American troops killed, wounded, or captured. Against that scale of violence, a single shared meal changes nothing about the war's outcome. It simply survives as a documented instance of exactly the kind of mercy that total war is structured to prevent. What makes the story durable, rather than merely sentimental, is the degree to which its central details have held up under scrutiny that many wartime anecdotes do not survive. The reunion in Maryland in 1996 was not staged for a family's benefit. It emerged organically, decades later, from an entirely independent source with no reason to embellish. That is a rarer form of corroboration than most stories of wartime kindness receive, and it is worth treating the Winken account with the seriousness that level of verification deserves, while still being honest that some of the finer details, the exact words exchanged, the precise emotional tenor of the evening, rest on memory rather than documentary record. Return, then, to that small cottage on the edge of the Hurtgen Forest, 16 December 1944. Outside, an offensive that would eventually claim tens of thousands of lives is grinding forward through the snow. Inside, for a matter of hours, none of that is permitted to matter. 7 men who have spent the war trying to kill each other's countrymen sit at a single table, share a modest meal prepared by a frightened woman, and part the next morning having actively helped one another survive. One of those men, a boy not yet a soldier, would spend the rest of his life carrying that night with him, eventually settling an ocean away and building bread for a living rather than anything resembling a weapon. It was not an entire battalion. It was 7 men, 1 meal, and 1 night. But in a war fought at the scale of hundreds of thousands, on a front stretching 80 miles, in a winter that killed with almost the same indifference as the shells did, that single night stands out precisely because it was not supposed to happen at all. Some stories earn their place in memory by changing history. This one earns its place by refusing, however briefly, to be swallowed by it. The doctor's name was Edgar Wohl, and what he did next has survived only because Robert Levine happened to keep, without understanding it, the one piece of paper that proved it. Field medicine in 1944 was not sophisticated by later standards, German or American. A forward surgical team worked with what could be carried: morphine, sulfa powder to fight infection before antibiotics were reliably available, crude but effective amputation instruments, and whatever improvised operating surface could be found, which, in this case, was a farmhouse table roughly the size of a modern kitchen island. Levine's leg was beyond saving. The shrapnel had shattered bone and torn tissue below the knee, and Wall made the decision any competent battlefield surgeon of either army would have made, amputating at the point of fracture to prevent gas gangrene, a bacterial infection that could kill within days in the dirt and damp of a Normandy summer. He dressed the wound with sulfa, administered the standard prophylaxis against gangrene, and, in a detail that says more about him than any grand gesture could, took the trouble to write down exactly what he had done and why in German on the back of a Nazi propaganda card bearing quotations from Hitler, the nearest scrap of paper to hand. It was not a confession, and it was not a declaration of conscience. It was, on its face, a clinical handover note of the kind any doctor might leave for whoever treated the patient next. What made it extraordinary was not written down at all. Wool had every reason, under the rules of his own army, to flag Levine's dog tag up the chain, to note the H, to ensure the prisoner was routed towards the separate and far harsher handling reserved for Jewish captives. He did not. Whether he deliberately overlooked it, quietly removed the tag himself, or simply chose not to mention what he had seen, the practical effect was the same. Levine went on to be processed, transported, and eventually held as an ordinary American prisoner of war, rather than being funneled towards Berga or somewhere worse. This is precisely the sort of act that leaves almost no trace. There was no order disobeyed on paper, no report filed, no witness with reason to remember it as anything other than routine battlefield surgery. If Levine had died of his wounds, or lost the scrap of card, or simply never thought to have it translated, Edgar Wool's name would not exist in any account of the war at all. Levine did not immediately grasp what the note meant. He could not read German, and he carried the card home to the Bronx more as a curiosity than a keepsake, a scrap of enemy paper from the worst day of his young life. It was only later, when the note was translated, that its clinical details, the crushed foot, the fracture, the amputation at the point of injury, the sulfa dressing, the vaccination against gas gangrene, revealed themselves as a record of careful, orthodox, entirely professional medicine offered to an enemy soldier the doctor had every institutional incentive to treat as something less than a patient. Records from the German side are, as one would expect, essentially silent on the matter. There is no surviving order, no unit diary entry, nothing from Wool's own hand explaining his reasoning, because acts like this were not the kind of thing a German army doctor wrote reports about in 1944. What can be said with confidence is limited to what the card itself proves and what Levine's own testimony, given decades later, describes. Beyond that, the historian is left with silence, and it would be dishonest to fill that silence with more certainty than the evidence allows. If you are finding this interesting, a quick subscribe helps more than you know, and it costs nothing but a tap. Set beside the vast machinery of German wartime medicine, Edgar Wool's quiet omission looks like a very small thing indeed, and it is worth being honest about scale before drawing any grand conclusion from it. The same medical corps that treated Levine produced men like Joseph Mengele, who used his position at Auschwitz to select prisoners for the gas chambers and to conduct lethal experiments on twins, and Sigmund Rascher, who froze concentration camp inmates in tubs of ice water at Dachau to study hypothermia. Actions for which nearly 200 German doctors were eventually implicated across the camp system. Against that record, one battlefield doctor quietly declining to flag a dog tag can look almost too small to mention. Yet it belongs to a real, if narrow, pattern of individual German physicians who used the limited discretion available to them to protect rather than harm. At Auschwitz itself, Hans Munch, who worked alongside Mengele in the SS Hygiene Institute, the court finding he had shown a benevolent attitude towards inmates rather than harm. On the Allied side, the treatment given back to captured German doctors tended, as a rule, towards professional courtesy rather than reprisal, with American and German physicians reported to have taught one another procedures across the wire, and German prisoners generally receiving care equivalent to Allied casualties. evidence that even amid total war, medicine retained pockets of a shared, older loyalty that outranked national uniforms. What set Wohl apart from the Munch case and made his story harder to trace is that he was not operating inside a bureaucratic camp system where individual acts of mercy eventually drew documentation, testimony, and trial records. He was a field surgeon on a moving front, and his one recorded act of quiet decency survives purely because a 19-year-old happened to keep a scrap of card in his shirt pocket. The material impact of what Wohl did is measurable in the plainest possible terms. Robert Levine came home. He built a life as a businessman running fast food restaurants, married, raised children, became a grandfather, and lived into his 90s, none of which was guaranteed for a badly wounded, captured Jewish American infantryman in the summer of 1944. The psychological impact, on Levine at least, ran far deeper than gratitude for a successful amputation. He spent nearly 40 years trying to identify the doctor who had saved him, working from nothing but a mistranslated scrap of card and a hazy memory of a dark-haired man in German uniform. The breakthrough came in 1981, during an emotional return visit to the Normandy coast, when a network of contacts built around the curator of the Utah Beach Museum finally traced the name to Wohl's family in Saarbrücken, allowing Levine to meet them, though the doctor himself was by then gone and the two men never had the chance to speak. It is worth being honest about what that legacy does and does not amount to. This is not a story of hundreds of lives saved by a single German physician, however satisfying such a claim might sound in a documentary. It is the story of one wounded prisoner, one quiet decision, and one scrap of paper that survived by accident. What the case does offer, credibly and without exaggeration, is proof that even within an army serving an ideology built on the deliberate sorting of human beings into those worth saving and those marked for destruction, individual conscience did not vanish entirely, and it occasionally expressed itself in the most understated way imaginable. A clinical note, correctly written, about a patient it would have been easier and safer to let the system swallow. Historians who study the German military medical corps caution against turning cases like this into a comfortable moral counterweight to Mengele or Rascher, and that caution is worth taking seriously rather than brushing aside for the sake of a tidier story. The vast majority of German doctors serving on the Eastern Front, in the camps, and in occupied territory either actively participated in atrocity or did nothing to prevent it, and the handful of documented exceptions, Wohl's quiet omission, Munch's refusals at Auschwitz, exist precisely because they were exceptions, rare enough to be remarkable, common enough that they cannot be dismissed as pure invention. No serious researcher claims to know how many other Jewish American soldiers may have had their dog tags overlooked by a sympathetic doctor, a merciful guard, or a clerk who simply failed to notice, because by definition, those acts left nothing behind to count. What survives is not a statistic. It is a single scrap of card, a single translated note, and a single family reunion in Saarbrücken in 1981. Standing in for a pattern of quiet decisions that the historical record can gesture towards, but never fully measure. Return then to that farmhouse kitchen in the bocage, to the table that was never meant to be an operating theater, to the dog tag catching the light as a doctor leans over a 19-year-old from the Bronx. Nothing about that moment was inevitable. Wohl could have flagged the letter H and walked away with a clear conscience under the rules of his own army. He could have said nothing about the amputation at all, left no note, given Levine no way of ever tracing him. He did neither. He treated the wound as any competent surgeon would, and then, in the smallest and least dramatic way possible, he declined to hand a frightened teenager over to a system built to destroy people exactly like him. No medal was struck for this, no file was opened. For nearly 4 decades, it existed only as a mystery in one American veteran's memory, and a few lines of German on the back of a propaganda card he could not read. That is the entire monument Edgar Wohl left behind. One life, one note, one family finally found.